Hello and welcome to the Pod Like a Pro podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to sharing tips, tricks, and personal experiences to help you to podcast like a professional. I'm Nat from Pod and Pen Productions, and I'm coming to you from a Wabakal country in New South Wales, Australia. This time on the podcast, you're meeting a person just like you who dreamt of producing a professional sounding podcast that connects with people and helps them navigate the world. Crystal Wong is from Melbourne, Australia, and she's the voice and drive behind the Melbourne Schools podcast. Hello, Crystal.
Hello.
What is the Melbourne Schools podcast about?
In the podcast, I invite people who are involved in education in Melbourne onto the podcast to chat to me. There are lots of questions that parents have about education in Melbourne and schools in Melbourne. I found that people don't know the answer to. So my goal with the podcast is to invite people like students, ex-students of schools, parents with kids at schools, principals and other people in education onto the podcast to ask them questions about it, basically. Today I'm chatting to Paul O'Shaughnessy from Regent Consulting. So that was 15 years ago when you first started. Have things changed a lot since then?
Yeah, I think it's even more competitive. I think there's more publicity, the internet, the forums, the social media, that's changed the information feed. So even something like yours where parents can go on and discuss and get real-time sort of feedback about what's going on at the various schools, that's far more prevalent than it was in, well, it's 2008 I started.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more there. If you start to Google, you can find things out about schools. And ironically, that often confuses people more.
And what do you hope your listeners get out of the experience of listening to your podcast?
Just a better understanding of the Melbourne education scene, like what the schools are like the culture in schools, the values that they have, what the actual experience is like for students going to those schools. Also, other things like how to navigate VCE, what's the difference between VCE and IB. Hopefully I'll get to invite some guests on.
They're the leaving certificates at the end of...
That's right, in Victoria.
How long had you wanted to make this podcast for, Crystal?
Oh, I've been wanting to make this podcast for a couple of years. Talking about schools came from when I was trying to choose a school for my own daughter. And I realised that there's so many things that I don't know about schools. How am I going to pick one? And from there, I wanted to talk to principals of schools because I think they lead the organisations of schools and they would be, great to be on podcasts. But I really didn't have the guts to start a podcast at that time.
Why? What was holding you back?
Oh, just being terrified of speaking in public, really? Yeah, just being afraid of being seen and, the thoughts of who am I to start a podcast? I'm just a regular parent. I'm not in the education scene. I'm just trying to pick a school for my own daughter. So, yeah, lots of doubts. I started lots of things before I started a podcast. I started a website talking about schools. I started a Facebook group. I started a newsletter. And finally, I realized the next step is the podcast and I have to start it.
How did you find the courage to start it?
Well, I got really frustrated at myself for not being able to. And it just became this big thing. It just became this big thing in my head holding me back. And it was just really frustrating and I got really annoyed at myself. And then one day I came across this Facebook post in one of the groups that I'm in by Liz saying that she was going to do this course. And I thought, right, I'm going to do this course and they're going to make me do this podcast. They're going to hold my hand and kick my butt until I do it. I thought it would make me do it. And basically, I saw the post on the weekend and it started on the Monday. And I thought, right, I'm just going to jump in and do this course. And yeah, by the end of it, I did have a podcast.
you took that leap.
I did.
And how have you found the process of getting the podcast off the ground?
Well, it's been a huge learning curve. It has been. And it hasn't been easy for me because of that fear. I really do have this fear of speaking, I think. But once I got a couple of interviews done, I felt a lot more comfortable with that. So, and it's been really great to have Liz and yourself there to ask questions of during the course, because I had this big fear of like, what if I'm live with the guest who I don't know? I'll invite some guests on that I don't know personally, and like the technology doesn't work, or I didn't record, or yeah, I just have this fear of wasting other people's time and like, yeah, looking silly in front of them going, I don't know what I'm doing.
I think that thing's a fear a lot of people have. It's that whole, oh, are they going to tell that I don't know what I'm doing? But really,
Yeah.
it's just about being honest. And I was in radio for 2 decades, and so many times the technology would fail. So many times I wouldn't hit record. So many times I would look like a total fool in front of somebody. But the more and more
Yeah.
that it happened, the easier it got. So would you say that confidence is something that built quicker than you thought it would?
Yes. Yes. After the first couple of tries and having things go wrong every single time that I did an interview, probably the first, 5 or 6 times, the problems that went wrong started repeating themselves. And then I started knowing what to do when that thing went wrong. Like, for example, the video didn't work. When the guest came on, I knew like to click out of it and click back into it. And usually that's fixed it. There was also always slow internet issues, and there's not a lot I can do about that really, but just to warn people and to get used to it. And then realizing that I can edit a lot of the issues out afterwards gave me a lot more confidence.
Yes, thank God for editing. That's
Yeah, that's
that's
right.
totally for sure. Was there anything that you found particularly challenging?
I think the hardest part was really just the first interview. That was the most challenging because I really had this mindset issue, I think. It blew up into this whole thing that was holding me back, and it was just a lot scarier than it actually was. Like, I made it out to be a lot scarier. Yeah, I'm not sure why.
It's almost as if the fear of actually doing something is actually more scary than the actual doing of it.
Oh, totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Like, doing the thing is actually really not that bad now. Like, actually interviewing people is really not that difficult. And it's not so different to a lot of the other stuff that I do. But I don't know why it was just one of those things that I just could not do. And I was telling everybody that I just can't do this. Yeah.
Was there anything that particularly surprised you?
One of the things that recently happened to me, I've been invited to speak at a conference.
Awesome.
Yeah, which is terrifying, but I think it's because, I don't know, like people obviously sort of know who I am.
You're a thought leader. You have a podcast coming.
That's pretty surprising. And I think, I mean, it was the other stuff too. Like, I mean, I've got that group going, but I think a lot of it is because I was starting to post the audiograms in the group.
Do you feel that it sort of gave a sense of like that you're a serious person about this? You've got the audio and you've got the bigger level of production that you're doing that people go, oh, this person's the real deal.
It's strange. People look at you differently. And I feel I look at other people differently when they have a podcast. But I guess we're all just regular people.
Everybody's just a regular person.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I think it's just learning the skill and having the confidence to put yourself out there.
Mm-hmm.
What advice do you have to somebody who's thinking about starting a podcast?
Oh, I don't know if I'm into it far enough to give advice.
Or is there something that you wish you had have been able to tell yourself from the future to past Crystal?
You should have done it earlier. Yeah, you need to get over this fear. But I always knew that. I needed to get over it, but I just couldn't do it. It's easier to like say things to yourself, but to actually do it, yeah, it's tricky.
So would you say it's finding support?
The course is definitely that's the way to go. Like if you're fearful like me, having that support and the other group members that are going through it, other people that are trying to start podcasts that you can, chat to about your problems and the issues that you're having, I think that definitely helps. Yeah, having the support definitely helps.
And what's your vision for the Melbourne Schools podcast at this stage? Where do you hope it's going to go?
I just wanted to start it. I've heard that a lot of podcasts stop after, a few episodes or a season or something. My hope for it is for it to keep going. I want to get good at this. I want to actually continue and get better and have an established podcast that is hopefully monetized as well. Hopefully it'll be more than just a platform for me to speak. It'll be establishing like a personal brand, I suppose.
Well, Crystal, thank you so much for sharing your experience of putting together the Melbourne Schools podcast, and congratulations on your speaking gig, and good luck with that.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
You're welcome. That's Crystal Wong from the Melbourne Schools podcast, which you can find on Spotify and Apple. Thank you for listening to the Pod Like a Pro podcast. And if you want to learn more about podcasting, you can sign up to our newsletter and read about our Pod Like a Pro podcasting course at podandpen.com.au. And until next time, happy listening.